Hi, and welcome to the pre-recorded webinar, Succession Planning, Ensuring a Smooth Transition, presented through the MASSCAP Training Center. My name is Jessica Benedetto, and I'm MASSCAP's Training and Resource Manager. MASSCAP is a statewide association of Massachusetts' 23 community action agencies. The MTC offers training and resources to enhance the ability of each agency to serve its clients, develop its staff and board, improve operations, and comply with funder requirements. I'm very pleased to introduce today's presenter, John W. Edwards, Jr., Principal Consultant with the Edwards Group Florida, Inc. John holds a master's degree in public administration, is a certified life coach, a certified community action professional through the National Community Action Partnership, as well as a nationally certified trainer in ROMA, the Results-Oriented Management and Accountability Framework used by the entire Community Action Network. Thank you so much for being here, John. Now let's get started.
Thank you, Jess, for that introduction, and thank you, MASSCAP, for allowing me to present this webinar today, Succession Planning, Ensuring a Seamless Transition. First, let me start with the learning objectives that we'll have for our webinar today. Number one, you will learn whose responsibility it is to actually conduct the succession plan. Two, we will identify the board's role in succession planning. Next, we will learn why vision and community impact are essential for succession planning. Fourth, you will learn how core values are necessary for succession planning. And then finally, the fifth, we will be able to learn the operational pieces of a succession plan. So let's start with succession planning and what it really is. So as you can see on the screen, it is a process whereby organizations ensure that employees are recruited and or developed, and we'll explain that a little bit more, to fill each key roles or each of the key roles within the organization. Often succession planning begins and ends with the CEO position. So in the marketplace, there are two distinct ways that a succession plan can be done. One is by replacement, that is, the agency looks at ways to replace a position or a vacant position after the incumbent has left the position. Or the other way is by way of development, which obviously we will lean toward the latter than the former in this presentation. I often refer to the book Good to Great by Jim Collins and his group of researchers, and they talk about that most of the good to great companies recruit and promote their CEOs from within. And so with that in mind, we will really be talking more about succession planning from a developmental standpoint rather than a replacement standpoint, although we'll touch on both throughout the webinar. So the objective of succession planning is to ensure that the organization continues to operate effectively when individuals occupying critical positions depart. So the board wants to ensure that there is smoothness going on regardless of any position becoming vacant. And therefore, it's incumbent upon the board to really take a look at this and to really adopt it in a way that makes sense when it comes to positions becoming vacant, that is, those key critical positions within the organization. And therefore, there are times that the succession plan may not include all existing leadership positions, but could include or should include those critical positions, which we will talk about a little bit as we go through this presentation today. So succession planning is a part of workforce planning. And in workforce planning, what we are really focusing in on would be the continual process used by the organization to align the needs and priorities of the organization with those of its workforce for the specific purpose of ensuring that the organization meets its goals and objectives going on. And so succession planning has a focus then of ensuring that we have appropriate bench strength in place for replacing critical positions. So what is bench strength? Well, I'm reminded of Dabo Swinney, who is the head coach of the Crimson Tigers football team. And of course, last year in 2015 season, they lost the national championship game to Alabama. And so when Dabo Swinney was asked about why he feels that Clemson lost the game, he said it was because he didn't have sufficient bench strength. That is, when the starters went out, they didn't have the quality of players sitting on the bench to replace the starting players, and therefore they became weak. So what did Dabo Swinney do this past offseason? He recruited, developed better players who were second-string players, third-string players, and obviously the rest is history. They won the 2016 National Championship football game. So then what is bench strength? It is an assessment of the organization's preparedness. That is, how the organization really prepares for replacing departing staff in those critical positions. So the critical positions that we often refer to are those who are the direct reports to the CEO position. They could be the chief finance officer, it could be the HR director, or whoever heads up that critical functioning within the organization. It could be program directors, your community service block grant director, it could be your housing director, or it could be your Head Start or child care director. What it really means is having other staff on board who are ready to step into someone else's position at the appropriate time, under the appropriate circumstances, with a virtual seamless transition. So we use the word appropriate here to highlight that it is a plan, that it is a disciplined process that the board would really want to develop and adopt and become disciplined to in order to make the transition virtually seamless. So succession planning is really one of the most uneasy discussions I've ever watched both boards and executive directors avoid. Generally, what happens is that the board avoids having the conversation because they don't want the executive director feeling like he or she is in trouble, or the board is not satisfied with their performance, and in essence the board may be looking for an opportunity to replace him or her. The ED often shies away from this conversation is because the ED does not want the board to get the feeling like he or she is really moving to another position, or in fact departing the current CEO functioning. So oftentimes they just don't have that conversation. So whose responsibility is it? Well, that's an interesting question because the way that we feel is that it is the board's responsibility to ensure that there is a smooth transition between the CEO positions or incumbents, as well as those who are in those key positions that we alluded to earlier. So if there is no system in place, or one that is informal to ensure things will run smoothly in the event of sudden departures of key employees, who's responsible? Who's accountable? Well, we believe the board is accountable. And therefore, this next point is really highlights that question. With the board sitting in that top box of the organizational chart, the board is accountable for ensuring a smooth transition in the organization. It continues to function effectively and efficiently. In essence, it doesn't really miss a beat in terms of carrying out its mission work mandate. The board does not have to do the work, however. The board members do have to ensure that the work will get done. So in essence, it is the board to create the process, to create the policy that will be used as a guide for ensuring that there is a succession plan, the contents of the succession plan, which we'll delve into a little later as we go through this webinar. The other thing is that the board benefits in that by gathering the pieces, parts of information needed and building the actual systems that can help the organization transition, that can only strengthen the board's ability to govern. And ultimately, what we recognize is that boards of directors are clearly responsible for overall governing. How do boards govern? They govern through policy. They govern through oversight. And therefore, a succession plan is likened unto that. What we recognize is that in the community action world, there are organizational standards. These are relatively new, having been in place now for several years. But there is one organizational standard of the 58 organizational standards for nonprofit organizations that really focus on succession planning. And it is in category 4, which is organizational leadership, meaning the board of directors and CEO, but primarily the organizational board of directors. Standard 4.5 says this: the organization has a written succession plan in place for the CEO, ED position that is approved by the governing board, which contains procedures for covering an emergency or unplanned short-term absence of 3 months or less, as well as outlines the process for filling a permanent vacancy. All right, so let's discuss this for a brief second. First point is that this particular standard is a compliance standard. It's important, but it's a compliance standard. Just the way that the standard is written suggests that this is a replacement plan rather than a development plan. And so while the compliance is good for ensuring that the board has a way of filling the gap if there is a 3 months or less absentee incumbent, as well as it outlines the permanent vacancy and how to fill it. That is a replacement plan. What we're really focusing here is, yes, the succession plan should have a replacement component, but it also should have a development component. And by and large, we're leaning toward the latter, that is development, than the former, a replacement succession plan. So what is the board's role in a succession plan? So the tendency of the board, many of them, is to think of succession planning in operational concerns. However, the most important aspect of the job is the strategic side. And what we mean by the strategic side is that what are the strategies, what are really the processes that the board has developed and are following that really focusing is on the strategic side of the succession plan. So where does the board start? Succession planning should really start with 2 most critical pieces of any organization's overall being, and I might add well-being, its vision and its values. So when we talk about vision, we're really looking at how the board looks down the road for this. So let's talk about just a story here that will kind of give a little context of what we're talking about succession planning as it relates to the vision and values. So listen to this story. A board who had never discussed vision and values had an ongoing disconnect with its visionary executive director. This visionary executive director was known throughout the community and across the country as a passionate leader in her field, accomplishing more than most humans could dream of when it comes to caring for those in need. The board, thinking all that vision stuff was superfluous, formed a succession planning committee comprised of business people who identified a list of business skills they wanted the replacement executive director to possess. So when their ED retired, she was replaced with a CPA, a certified public accountant, who had great business credentials. In no time, the staff rebelled. The organization's community partners did too. And the organization went into a tailspin that no business skills could cure. After 18 months, the new ED was gone. Finally, the board was ready to talk about the vision and values at the heart of the organization's work. As you look at your community and at many EDs who have retired and the replacements who have failed, you will be surprised at how often vision and values are at the core of that failure. So let's talk about vision and community impact, and then we'll talk a little bit more about values. So for succession planning to prepare the organization for its next leader, the board must have a clear vision for the future. The organization wants to create for itself, for the community, to know what the community vision to seek in its new executive director's successor. And while a vision for the future of the organization itself is helpful, it is more important that your leader has a vision for the community impact that he or she wants to create. So we want to talk a little bit more about vision, community impact, and really what is your community. So the other area that is critical for success is a clearly articulated written set of core values against which the board will measure its successful executive director or future executive director. So when we talk about core values, we're talking about things like productivity, things like being able to produce work in a timely, quality manner. Other examples of core values could be productivity. It could be honesty and integrity. So whatever those core organizational values are, it's incumbent that the board really has those in place, and really the board has adopted such values. In the book, The Leadership Challenge by Kuntz and Posner, they talk about the real value of modeling the way. That is, modeling and clarifying values by finding a single voice and affirming those shared ideals. They also talk about that these core values are a set of values, and they are exampled by aligning the actions with those shared values. So first, the shared values are necessary, and two, they must be shared, and three, they have to be modeled. So if your organization does not have a written set of core values as a means for measuring whether or not actions and decisions adhere to those values, the board really and the organization will not be able to determine if the prospects for the ED position or for other key positions really share those values. So clearly we're looking at the vision. What does the board really see as its vision for the organization, as well as for community impact that the organization wants to do into a future state of being. So let's talk a minute about the operational pieces of a succession plan. Remember the strategic side, vision and values. Now we will get down to the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts, if you will, of having these key operational pieces in place, not just for the executive director position, but for other key positions as well, whatever those key positions are that the organization decides what those are. The first point here is always have a current position description. Are they current for those key positions? It's really a qualitative question, because you always want to ensure that the duties and responsibilities in any position description are up to date and that they really mirror the functioning of the position. So part of the performance evaluation of the executive director could be to ensuring that the organization position descriptions, including obviously that of the executive director, are always up to date, a critical point here. Number two, what do you do? So this is different from the actual duties and responsibilities in the position. This is a task list or a list of tasks of what the employee actually does. So in other words, what does the employee do every day? What do they do once a week? And when do they do it during that week? What do they do monthly, quarterly, and annually? So these are questions that should be asked and answered in a way that will give the board and the CEO a clear picture of what the clear functionings are daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, really annually, of the effective functioning of any position. Number three, a calendar. So stemming from the task list, and in addition to it, have key staff fill out an annual calendar. So a calendar, obviously 12 months, 5 days a week, really identify those key lists of tasks that are done so that the board can have a quick view of all those that happen on a regular basis throughout the year and really can prepare what is necessary for that to take place. Number four, where is everything? So everything is really everything. So where are the keys to the building? Keys to the desk, keys to the office. Where are those critical key procedural and policy initiatives that the ED or those key positions really have that they rely upon? Those need to be identified and obviously updated as well. What are the critical relationships? Obviously, community action is not an island unto itself, so therefore it is critical to have relationships external to the organization among community partners, among other community leaders, so that there is really an understanding as to who the ED or the other key position incumbents relate to on an ongoing basis that really helps the organization to be successful now and into the future. Number six, fund development is critically important. Rainmaking, how does these positions really carry out, really developing those relationships that will actually generate additional external revenue being brought to the organization going forward. Redundancy is really kind of a funny word here in this context, but it really makes sense. So in other words, humans have two kidneys. Why do humans have two kidneys? Because if one goes down, then you always have another to keep us alive. Hospitals have backup generators. Why? Because if they lose power, then obviously they're taking care of the sick, so they don't want to lose power, so they have backup generators to ensure that there is a smooth transition until the new system is in place. TV stations have backup cameras. It's not really cool for a TV station to go on the blink, so obviously they have backup cameras for themselves. So the essence here is that redundancy is one of the surest approaches to short-term stability. In other words, you got to have a backup plan in the face of loss of a key employee, a critical point here that obviously we would raise up for your consideration. The board should have a policy in place that provides for the following. But first, let me talk about a policy. A policy really is the way that the board governs. The board governs through policy development and policy implementation and a feedback system that allows for that policy to be fed back to the board on an ongoing basis to ensure that the policy is being followed. Therefore, the executive director should have at least 2 staff positions that are familiar with the critical duties of that position description and can perform those duties in an emergency situation. critically important. It goes back to the 3-month or less that we talked about, the organizational standard 4.5 early in this presentation. So it's important that the ED should require the same of other key organizational positions. So in other words, it's called cross-training, we used to call it. It's called your backup plan. It's also called your redundant way of ensuring that there is another level of functioning that could be called upon in the event there is an emergency that comes up in any of your key positions. Monitoring is very important, which is the 8th step of the operational pieces, and planning is only part of the process, clearly. You got to have a way to be able to monitor it at least on an annual basis or more frequently, the plan to ensure that it's being implemented and the directives outlined in the policy are really being followed. Without that, of course, the board really has no way of knowing how this process is really working. And then ask yourself this question, board members. If the executive director took a vacation this year, this week, today, and never came back, what would scare the pants off the board about having to ensure the operation keeps going? That's a critical question. It's not a rhetorical question. It's really a question for the board to really ponder and answer to it, and therefore develop a process or policy that would really prevent them from being scared to death. So here's a practical guide to CEO succession planning. Very important for us to consider. Establish the foundation. That is, you really want to be able to really look at the type of succession plan that you want to have. You want to be able to create the succession plan. You want to be able to conduct regular in-depth reviews of that succession plan. You want to be able to compare the list of capabilities to the organization's senior talent pipeline. So you want to look at what the capabilities are of your senior staff positions. Do they need further development? Do they need more education? Do they need more training? And then finally, you want to be able to implement the plan. So how do you develop a succession plan? You want to determine the type of plan. You want to be able to put the succession planning team together, which is a critical step. It could be the executive committee of the board. It could be the strategic planning committee of the board. It could be an ad hoc committee of the board, just some examples. You want to be able to identify the main factors that will influence your plan. That is, is it something you need to do quickly? Is it something that you need to look at the influence of your vision for the organization or your core values or your strategic direction of the organization? Next, you want to be able to link succession to the strategic plan. This is a critical point here because the strategic plan really then looks at the future. It lists its core values. It identifies the strategic direction of the organization. So clearly succession should be part of the overall strategic direction that the board really looks at as a part of its strategic planning process. Identify sources for succession candidates. Yeah, you can look internal in the organization, especially for development, but if the board chooses to consider external candidates, then where will you get those candidates from is the question here. So identify those sources and then shape the action. That is the goals that you want to achieve, the timelines by which you want that done, and of course, always have some accountability embedded in this. So the last word is whether you are developing a succession plan for a small family, a business, a large nonprofit organization, an educational institution, even a major corporation clearly, or a government organization, the process is the same as identified on the previous slide. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present this webinar to you today, Succession Planning, Ensuring a Seamless Transition. And I'll now turn it back over to Jess.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation and that it's been informative and helpful. Thank you so much to John for all this great information. We invite you to visit the MASSCAP Training Center at www.masscap.org, where you can find our training calendar and so much more. And you're also welcome to contact me at jessbenedetto@masscap.org with any questions or to receive additional information or resources. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to have you visit again the MTC with all of our exciting upcoming trainings.